Get 'em.
Welcome, folks. Y'all come on in and make yourself at home. This here, well, this is the Rolling Thunder Podcast, your home for all things Rolling Thunder. This episode is brought to you by Mossy Oak, because everything is better in Bottomland. Kent Cartridge, quality matters, performance counts. Shen Gear, waterfowl gear that is built better. And Benelli USA, dominate the skies.
Welcome to another episode of the Rolling Thunder Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Kinney, joined by RT Bailey.
Present.
And Spencer Halford, once again.
What's going on, buddy?
Man, everything.
Everything at the same time.
At the same time. You ever seen that movie, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close?
Yeah. Should we go through a real quick
list? I think
list?
we should. Yeah.
Because, like,
of our regular Tuesday?
I've completely blown out my favorite pair of shorts picking up a box this morning.
The
cows have gotten out. So RT and I, in the midst of, like, pre-lunch, had to wrangle 3 cows. I've never done that before.
3/4 of a mile.
Yeah. We had to go through, like, neighbors' yards I haven't met yet with a feed bucket. They stopped at a pond, had to get in the pond, get them out of that pond because they were hot. It's been it's not even like 3 o'clock on a Tuesday.
That's awesome.
Well, we have an interesting guest today. At least I think that he's interesting. And so I'm going to tell everybody he's interesting and we'll see. But I have a pretty good, they say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I've hunted with Mr. Thiel's son several times, and he's a character. So I'm assuming that since the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, the tree's got to be, pretty amusing as well. So Mr. Dan Thiel.
Yes.
You go by Dan?
Yes.
Daniel?
Dan.
Okay, great. Is our guest today, and he is high brass with Ducks Unlimited, and past that, I don't know exactly what you do for a living. So
I've been with Ducks Unlimited for 23 years.
Okay.
I started as the National Chief Development Officer, but about 15 years ago became what's known as the Executive Secretary. And the Executive Secretary is the corporate officer who oversees the board relations.
Okay.
And Ducks Unlimited, when you consider that we have 650,000 dues-paying members and 1.6 million people follow us on social media, we have a very large board.
Sure.
Our board is 65 officers and directors from around the United States that govern Ducks Unlimited. The other organization that I work with is, we'll call it a subsidiary of Ducks Unlimited. That is Wetlands America Trust. Founded in the 1950s as the Ducks Unlimited Foundation, changed the name in the 90s to better reflect the broader mission. Today, Wetlands America Trust is one of the nation's largest accredited land trusts. And a land trust works with conservation-minded individuals and hold conservation easements on great habitat. And we have about 500,000 acres under permanent conservation easement. It's beneficial to the landowner, beneficial for the environment.
So basically it means that that's going to be a wetland forever.
Very much so. And so we've broadened our reach. So for the first 35 years of Wetlands America Trust, we focused only on land beneficial to waterfowl. And there's a lot of it.
Sure.
And major holdings in the low country of South Carolina. We were one of 3 organizations that really started the awakening of the conservation movement in that rapidly developing area in the early 90s. Thank goodness we did, because that is truly one of the fastest growing places on the Atlantic coast. And
the state of South Carolina is very raw and undeveloped, which is amazing.
It is. When you think about what we call the DU culture, or the culture of wetlands, waterfowl, and the great outdoors, there's no place like the Ace Basin of South Carolina. Wonderful area. And today, because of the great work we were doing 30 years ago, we have been able to permanently protect literally hundreds of thousands of acres. That land today, had it not been protected, would be the next site for the next Mercedes production facility, Boeing. I mean, they're all moving to that part of the country. So thank goodness we were there.
Yeah, no kidding.
That's incredible. Does anybody have the turkey hunting rights on any of that ground in South Carolina?
Oh, yeah. Call me sometime.
It's not a no.
It's not a no.
I was like Dumb and Dumber, so you're saying there's a chance.
So one of the cool things about the conservation easement is it's perpetual. It lasts forever. And part of that arrangement is Wetlands America Trust is going to work with the landowner, with our biologist, and we will help you develop a land use plan. And we will carve out property or acreage that you can use for future development, but the rest of it is hands off. You need to leave the habitat intact. We will work with landowners for timber harvest. We'll work with landowners for crops and building better wetlands. Every year we do an annual inspection tour, and sometimes we try to time those tours so that it coincides
randomly
with the turkey season, sometimes duck season.
There you go.
It just comes with the job.
That's great.
Yeah, hazard of the job.
So the ideal customer is somebody who owns a piece of property that is, I guess it's a wetlands, right? And
so we also work, so waterfowl use multiple habitats, of course wetlands, but also grasslands. And some ag production area, especially rice. So as the world knows, rice lands are incredibly important to waterfowl, especially in the Pacific Flyway, because 95% of all natural wetlands have been destroyed. They've been developed into housing. So that group of rice farmers in California, they are really the piece of the puzzle that holds it together for migrating waterfowl in the Pacific Flyway.
that's their water.
That's their water.
Yeah.
And of course, not to deviate too far from your question, but one of the challenges in the Pacific Flyway is the drought. The drought has had an incredibly negative impact on water availability. This year, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service issued an edict based on other species, and there's a species of fish that needs that water as much or more than waterfowl need that water. Rice producers in California have only been allowed to plant 50% of what they planted last year. So at the beginning of the migration, ducks are going to find a lot less water in the Pacific Flyway than they found last year.
Wow.
So just a real quick story on how easements work. So let's say a landowner in Brinkley, Arkansas has 1,000 acres and it's worth $10 million. That individual knows the value for migrating waterfowl. It's great wintering habitat for ducks. He has no intention of developing that land. He wants to preserve it. And he wants to make sure that his heirs or the next individual who owns that property is going to be bound by an edict which keeps that land together and preserved. He does a conservation easement with Ducks Unlimited. There are over 1,000 land trusts in the United States. The best land trusts are accredited, and that accreditation is a very rigorous process. We were one of the first. We're also one of the largest in terms of number of acres and number of easements. So when he puts that land in conservation easement, and I said earlier it's worth $10 million, when he puts it under easement with Wetlands America Trust, it automatically loses 50% of its value because it can't be developed. He is going to receive a significant tax benefit based on the difference in the value of that property. And so, people are motivated by different things.
Right. And that's what I was trying to get at was, who's your ideal customer? What motivates them? Is it taxes? Is it, legacy? Is it,
The best landowner is a little bit of both.
Okay.
And part of this annual inspection and the relationship, the majority of those landowners become friends, donors. They will become partners with Ducks Unlimited. We want them to become partners. We want this to be an ongoing relationship. We want them to introduce us to their neighbors so we can continue to do more conservation easements.
Who sets the rules for the conservation easement? Is that a federal program, or do you all get to set the rules for that?
The IRS plays a pretty big role in this.
I figured it might,
and so one of the challenges we face, and it's not a DU challenge because we don't get into any conservation easements that we think may be a little on that side of the equation. We work primarily with individual landowners, and their goal is to save their land in perpetuity. There are, we'll call them strategies. Another term would be scheme, to take a marginal piece of property, put a high value on it, and then do the easements from there. IRS is they're vigorously pursuing those because those folks are simply trying to avoid taxes.
Sure.
And the IRS knows that. And unfortunately, the actions of a very small number of people impact everybody.
Sure. How much do you have to play police officer in that world?
But that varies, not much. Most of these folks it's never the person who did the easement. It's almost always the heir or the next owner. As an example, a very notable, wonderful patron for Ducks Unlimited in Memphis had a beautiful property in Montana. Wetlands America Trust held the easement on it. This individual sold it just before his death. The new landowner, who is from Los Angeles, said, well, that easement means nothing to me. That was with the previous owner. I want to build a 20,000 square foot house on an overlook that's outside of what's in the easement. The easement does not allow for him to build a huge structure on this piece of property. We actually went to court recently in Montana, and the good news is the easement won. He was not able to build the house that was not included in the original easement document. Now, I want to stress for anyone that might have interest in easements, we are easy to work with. We're very mindful of how situations change. This gentleman just had a flagrant disregard for the whole purpose of a conservation easement. 100% of the folks that do easements with DU do it for the right reason. They do it to protect the habitat.
Yeah. So, all right, so let's back up for just a second and define the term easement, because a lot of our listeners are not going to know what easement means. And in my frame of reference, an easement is like access across land. That's a type of easement, right?
That is, in this term, the term easement is more focused on not so much ownership, but use.
Direction of use, basically.
Exactly. So when you do a conservation easement, you are surrendering all future development potential of that property. So that's the easement they are giving up.
And is that a document that gets like attached to the deed?
Oh, it is. Yes, it's highly formalized, structured. It's recorded.
It's filed and recorded.
Yes, very definitely.
And I'm assuming that since there's a trust involved, that there's some compensation to the individual. Is that only through tax credits, or is it sometimes do you purchase an easement?
So that's an interesting question. The only place where Ducks Unlimited, we purchase easements in two locations: the Pacific Flyway, and we do that in the Pacific Flyway because the incredible land value that's in that area, and there is federal money available to allow us to buy that easement. It then gives money then to the landowner, which encourages them not to sell that land for housing development. The other place we buy easements is in the Dakotas. In the Dakotas, we could do an entire podcast just on the challenges and the incredible importance of the Dakotas, because that's the prairie pothole. That's the nesting ground. That's ground zero for Ducks Unlimited.
Right.
It's where we first started working in the United States. It's where we started working in Canada in the 30s. A greater percentage of waterfowl are nested and raised in the prairies than anywhere else in the United States or Canada. They're critically important. North and South Dakota have some very draconian land ownership laws. In fact, North Dakota does not allow Ducks Unlimited to own land in North Dakota.
Wow.
So what we do in North Dakota is we will buy an easement from a landowner, and we have a list of over 1,500 primarily ranchers who are trying to continue and maintain their ranching lifestyle, which gets tougher and tougher every year. So we buy then a conservation easement. And I shared earlier, I've been with DU for 23 years. When I started at DU, you could buy an easement on a piece of property in the Dakotas for $40 an acre. Today, it's in the multiple hundreds of dollars an acre. And the price just goes up because the price, and the other thing that's happened is genetically modified seed has changed the landscape in the Dakotas. So in some parts of the Dakotas, they get less than 15 inches of precipitation. Genetically modified seed now allow corn, soybean, wheat to be grown in places that it was never intended to grow row crop agriculture. It was intended to be tall grass prairie. Perfect for waterfowl, perfect for ducks. So what we do, because we're not allowed by the state to own land, we will buy an easement, and then we will immediately transfer ownership to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service is our partner, and I'll just point out, all of us are duck stamp buyers. The majority of federal in the history of the United States, there's no more efficient, wonderful, beneficial program than the federal duck stamp program. I think the number is like 95% of all waterfowl stamp income, which exceeds $1 billion in history, is used to buy and preserve wetland habitat for waterfowl. And a lot of it goes to the prairies for purchasing these easements.
So does that money get disseminated through grants? How does that money get handed out?
It's a complicated process. Everything we do is complicated. Sure. There's an entity known as NAWCA, which distributes funding. We work very closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Fish and Wildlife Service has regions all across the United States. We work out of the Denver region. And what we've discovered, we have major donors who have given DU literally tens of millions of dollars with the primary purpose of buying and protecting these conservation easements in the prairies. The challenge in this system is the federal government. We are overwhelming them because they have a process, and it's an arduous process. They have to do the biodiversity survey. They have to do the boundaries. They have a lot of stuff they have to do in order to accept the easement and put it to completion. So it's a huge part of our conservation program. We do buy land, and historically, Ducks Unlimited, Wetlands America Trust was not in the land buying business. What we've discovered is in the last several years, there are lots of states and lots of regions which want to preserve waterfowl habitat. They do not have the financial resources to do so. Ducks Unlimited is able to immediately put money on the ground to buy a piece of property, and we're competing with farmers.
Yeah.
Some farmers want to buy this land for row crop agriculture. Some duck hunters want to buy this land so that they can own their own place to duck hunt. And there's a balance between not being the jerk, not being the bully on the block, buying too much land. We work very closely with all of our on-the-ground partners. And one of the hallmarks to DU's 85 years of success, we partner with everybody. We partner with every state game and fish agency. We partner with the Army. I mean, even though the Army Corps of Engineers do some things which drive us nuts in terms of wetland degradation and the loss of wetlands, they're also a great partner in trying to restore wetlands. So we have found over the years it's important to partner with everyone and try to find workable solutions. And we're very good at that.
That's intense.
It is very.
There's so much more. There's so much behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Hey, Ducks Unlimited wants to buy this. What do you think? Oh, sure. I figured it was that easy.
Well, and part of the
Everybody's got the
challenge
Ducks'
is
best interests at heart.
so people want to know, what are you doing in my backyard? And it's taken generations to have duck hunters and conservation supporters understand and appreciate that working in your backyard may not be in the best interest of waterfowl. That working in the nesting ground is probably the highest priority. If you want to make maximum benefit to waterfowl, work where they're born. And the challenge is, we are in a race against time against a lot of factors. And that the factor is genetically modified seed have changed the playing field up there. And, 20 years ago, they couldn't plant this land. Now they can. So, recently the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service duck survey came out. And that survey is pretty important to us. And I'll give a shout out to Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited, back before there was a Ducks Unlimited, there were actually two groups ahead of DU. One was North American Wildfowlers, founded in 1927. Nash Buckingham, the famous Memphian, was the paid executive secretary of North American Wildfowlers. The wealthy group of Northeast businessmen, duck hunters, who founded this group, then founded another group in the 30s called More Game Birds in America Foundation. That same group of people are the group that founded Ducks Unlimited. So even though we were officially born in 1937, the same group of people that were doing the work in 37 were doing the work in 27. What they discovered, because what they tried to do was to develop the European game model. And the European game model is pen-raised or farm-raised birds. It works with pheasants. It works a little bit with quail, but it doesn't work with ducks.
Yeah.
And it took this group of dedicated hunter conservationists. They put literally millions of dollars in the 20s and 30s into this model. They took it across the United States and recruited farmers to pen raise birds and release birds. And it didn't take them very long to discover this is not enough. It's not going to work. And so that same group of people did what was called the first wild duck census. And that wild duck census was essentially the aerial survey in 1934, which a great majority of the technique that they use today in the aerial surveys was done by this group of guys in a bunch of old tail-dragging airplanes in the 30s. So there's about a half a dozen DU history books, and I've read all this. It's pretty incredible. You talk about some brave individuals. If you think about it, the airplane was only 15 years old when they were doing this.
Yeah, I was going to say, what did they do, strap them to a kite? You say 1930, and I don't feel like there's...
Yeah, when you look at, World War I was really the development of the aircraft. I mean, yeah, the Wright brothers did it in, 1903, but it wasn't until World War I that they really developed widespread use for aircraft. This group of brave scientists, conservationists said, let's get in those aircraft and fly and land on water and count ducks.
So these guys are like flying steermen out there, trying to.
Yep,
so
that's
exactly.
wild.
There's two things here I want to zero in on that I just think is fascinating. So nearly 100 years ago,
they thought
there
they
were
had
dudes who were just as crazy about duck hunting as we were.
It's pretty awesome.
I mean, like, we've all been there when our wife is like, "You're doing what? At what time? Why are you doing?"
Mm-hmm. What time are you getting up tomorrow morning?
Guys who are pioneers in that way.
When you read these accounts, and I've read a bunch, and it's incredible. They were, number one, they were lucky. Nobody died while doing that.
Yeah.
They were incredibly dedicated and disciplined in how they did it. They did it for darn near nothing. These guys weren't paid a great amount of money. There was just a spirit of we've got to understand.
They believed in the cause.
They have to believe.
Yep.
What was happening? We were in a massive drought. This was the Dust Bowl of the 30s, and the reality, not to get too deep of history, but that geography of Canada was never intended to be row crop agriculture. It was tall grass prairie.
That's where the
And-
buffalo lived in the in the summertime.
And so you have to look at what was happening on a world stage. So go back in the teens and 20s and what was happening in Europe, in the countries of Russia, and massive famine and totalitarian governments. So what was happening, both the United States and Canada said, hey, we got free land. Send your people to our country,
That's right.
and we'll provide free land if they'll become farmers.
They'll settle it, yeah.
We were an agrarian-based economy in that era. And so here's what happens. Here all these crazy Scandinavians and Hungarians and Russians move to the prairies, and they break the prairie. They plow it up, and it worked when they had water. But when the drought hit, they were absolutely not prepared
Wiped
for
out.
what happened next. You can't grow these crops without water. And so what they created was an enormous mess in Canada. And so when Ducks Unlimited was founded in 1937, the goal was to generate a few $100,000 a year, do it for 5 years, and we would fix forever the duck challenge. If we could just put $3 to $5 million on the ground in Canada, we could fix this.
Knock it out.
But the key was they were buying some of this land in that time period for $2 an acre. It had no value. No one had any money.
Wow.
And they were buying and selling the land for $2 an acre. So that's why Ducks Unlimited went to work, and that's why we started. And we only did conservation work, conservation delivery in Canada, in the prairies of Canada, from 1937 to 1984. And in 1984, our scientists said, "No, wait a minute. There are a lot of ducks that depend on prairie habitat for
In the
being
US,
born,
yeah.
and equally important, we have migration corridors and wintering habitat." And so it was a complete game changer, and it was all. We've always been based on science. Science told us you need to work for the life cycle of North American waterfowl.
Go ahead.
All right. I was going to say, I'm glad you brought up Canada because I didn't know that Ducks Unlimited was a Canadian thing before it was an American thing. And one of my questions before you went into that was going to be, you guys have all these issues getting on ground in the Dakotas. Do you have the same kind of issues across the border? Like, is it easier? Is the government more, voluntarily, cooperative?
So it's different by province. In the United States, we're very much a federal-focused government. In Canada, it's very provincial. And some provincials are much easier to work with. They're more focused on conservation than other provinces. Canada has always been incredibly important to us. Let me stress, there are 3 Ducks Unlimited organizations. Ducks Unlimited, Inc. in the United States, Ducks Unlimited de Mexico. We're really the only major conservation organization doing work in Mexico. Mexican habitat is critical for wintering waterfowl. We were started in 1974 to do work in Mexico. The conservation work in Canada, we had to create Ducks Unlimited Canada in 1938. So we work across the continent with 3 different organizations, and we're very different organizations. Each organization has its own board of directors. They each have their own paid staff. However, in the eyes and the mind of most of our members, they only see one DU.
That's right. Yeah.
And we try to keep it that way. That there's no gain in trying to hey, that's DU Canada. They're different from us.
Yeah.
No, we're all about the same mission. We all share that similar mission, which is let's preserve habitat for waterfowl.
In your 20 some odd years of being there, have you ever gotten to participate in the aerial survey or ride along?
No, so now the survey is very strictly managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Gotcha.
And I've heard great stories about the adventure that is that survey.
Oh, I'm sure it's incredible.
I have flown around Canada quite a bit in de Havilland Beavers, amphibious aircraft. I don't know how those guys did it in the 30s with that primitive stuff they dealt with.
So I said I noticed 2 things you said, and I wanted to point them out. One was about the adventure 100 years ago. But the other I thought was really interesting that I have not given much consideration to, which is that you said you hear from people all the time, what are you doing in my backyard? And I didn't think about, when I kind of tried to envision your job and what all it entails and the the other people in your organization, I didn't think about what a stark contrast you have to live in, like with respect to, say, NWTF, because what they do is in the backyard. You know, they're not working with a migrating bird like you guys are. And so I think I'd like for you to go there just a little bit more, because I think that it's good for us to think about the fact that there's a priority on the home front of where the breeding population happens, and making sure that, because you guys can build an impoundment right here behind the shop, but that's not going to help more ducks be born next year. And that's kind of your point, right?
We're heavily guided by science, and about every 5 years, our science team, and it's both the United States team, the Canadian team, and our partners in Mexico, they're very collaborative in the work they do. And this is very, very high level, looking at as much information as possible. And we determine what are the highest priority areas. And as I shared earlier, you know, California it's a disaster. Overdevelopment and now drought, diminishing water resources. That makes it a very high priority, because we're really the only organization doing landscape size conservation work in that very important flyway. We do work in all 50 states. We have done conservation projects around the United States. We have field staff, both field fundraising staff, the regional director that does the Ducks Unlimited dinner. We have biologists in most states. We have regional offices across the country. So we do projects in the backyard, but it's always determined by what's most important.
Sure.
And what happens often is we are approached by our partners. So as an example, Louisiana Department of Fisheries and Game is a great partner. Florida Fish and Wildlife Service, Indiana DNR, they are wonderful partners. They will come to us and they will ask, they'll tell us, hey, look, the most important waterfowl project in Indiana is the beekeeper slough in Greene County, Indiana. Will you help us generate funds so that we can pursue matching? Almost every DU project you see in the United States has matching dollars. And so when we do a Ducks Unlimited dinner, whether it's in Memphis or Nashville, those dollars go to a very national, continental use. And we then take Ducks Unlimited money raised at the local event. We put major donor money or major sponsor money with it. And then we use state game and fish money. We use foundation money. And so we have become, by a sense of necessity, masterful at finding partners to help us in our mission.
How did you get into this line of work?
That was going to be my question, man. Let's take it back. 1998. I want to know about, the Thiel heritage, and did you grow up, hunting with your dad, and how you landed at Ducks Unlimited?
Well, are you a Memphian?
No, sir. I grew up on a small horse and cattle farm in Indiana. Went to college on a scholarship to study archaeology. Did it. I worked in Honduras for 6 months. Went to grad school.
As an archaeologist?
As an archaeologist. Worked at the Mayan site of Copan.
This is our second archaeologist we've had on here.
Wow.
So there's another nerd around here.
I love it. It's great.
So I get to graduate school at UT Knoxville, and it didn't take me very long to figure out I'm not going to make it. And it was something called statistics. And then all those I had to take 2 foreign languages to get the doctorate. So I bailed. And I landed in the wonderful world of university fundraising. Went to Purdue University, worked at Purdue for a few years. Indiana State, I met a young lady who was from Memphis, and she was a traveling sorority consultant. We date. I visit her as a friend for Thanksgiving in Memphis, and it was decided that I would be invited to go hunting with her father and the 2 brothers. I did not want to do this. I came down to see the girl. I didn't come down to go duck hunting. I didn't know what duck hunting was. Next thing you know, I'm at the Jonesboro, Arkansas 24-hour Walmart buying all the gear and a gun.
You're getting vetted.
Oh, big time.
Full tilt.
And it was a terrible time. It was 2-duck limit, and it was the year after they had switched from lead to steel, so everybody's angry anyway.
Oh, yeah.
And my wife's family hunt on the St. Francis River sunken lands near Truman, Arkansas. They have a camp, and so I'm at camp. I don't know anybody but this.
Is it Hatchie Coon?
Hatchie Coon is adjacent.
Okay.
Okay. So we actually own our own camp.
Okay.
And we had 2 wonderful blinds, one on the river, one in the woods. And I have been kidnapped to go to duck camp. And this predates cell phones. So
With these 3 guys you really don't know.
Yeah, and
I don't
sunken,
know.
The sunken lands that's like a whole world of its own. I mean,
this could be a whole nother podcast
Oh,
talking
yeah.
about the adventures on the sunken lands.
63 was not a 4-lane
No.
divided. I mean, it was every stoplight from the bridge to the sunken lands
And
was.
Spence, as you are about to find out, since you have 2 teenage daughters, that future father-in-law doesn't like me. And here I am sharing camp, and the next morning I go out for the opening day of duck season. The tradition in the Burton family is they have a big floating blind on the river, and it's got a shooting porch, and then it's got an enclosed, 10 by 12, about the size of this room. And within 2 hours, the Burton boys are in there cooking on the charcoal grill and drinking something called Dr. Kuiper's or DeKuyper's peach schnapps.
Oh, yeah.
And I am miserable. I'm sitting out there by myself with a brand new 12-gauge shotgun, which I've never shot, and
Freezing to death while your
wondering-
future father-in-law is drinking peach schnapps.
what have I done to deserve this
Why me, Lord?
situation? All of a sudden, I have to look up the river, and I see what I know now was a mallard drake flying down river. It circles over our blinds. Of course, I don't know how to blow a duck call. It comes right over the decoys. I step up, and I shoot it. And when I pulled the trigger on that gun, the inside of that blind exploded, and those 3 men came out yelling and cussing, and they think I was playing with the trigger, and I
misfired.
shot the gun. And I said, no, I shot a duck. Like, well, you couldn't have. There are no ducks. And sure enough, you hadn't seen any ducks that morning. Finally, the older brother says, Bob, floating down the river, there's a duck. There's a dead duck in the river. Bob jumps in his boat, races down river, and he picks the bird up, and I see him look at it, and I see him throw it on the floor of the boat in disgust. He races back, slides up in front of the blind. Of course, we're all hanging over the edge. I'm giddy,
Thrilled.
because I shot a duck. And my future father-in-law looks at me and he says, Daniel, do you have any idea what a banded duck means?
No way.
No
I said,
way.
is it that white band around its neck? And he threw the duck at me. My first bird was a banded bird.
He threw the duck at me.
Yeah. That man has hated me ever since.
Promise. Oh, my goodness.
And I've been fortunate. I've shot a number of banded birds, and I've always kept a hope that my dear old father-in-law one day would, and he still hadn't killed a banded bird. But,
Man.
so that was my start. That was very, and so the other thing is, finally I got the hell out of camp and got back to Indiana to my job, and my future father-in-law would call and say, hey, ought to be a good weekend. Why don't you come back? Why don't you come back?
Man.
So I drive back 7 hours the next couple of weekends. It's miserable. All it is, they like to eat and drink and have fun.
That's
And
right.
it was fun at camp, but nothing happened in the duck blind. And finally, near the middle of January, my future father-in-law calls and he whispers, they're in the woods. And I had no idea what that meant. I said, Bob, what does that mean? He said, get down here now. We're going hunting in the morning. The birds have found the woods. And the Burton family had 2 duck holes. It's called the Stud Horse. And so I drove down.
What a freaking moniker. That is a great name
It's a
for
great
a hole.
name for a great
Yeah.
duck blind. And so, sure enough, next morning was mad. I get goosebumps right now.
Yeah.
40 years later, I'm
The
thinking
river had
about
gotten
it.
out and they had shallow water hole.
Yeah, that's got to be at 216. And when it's at 216, the birds find the stud horse, and it was game on. 2-bird limit. And, of course, everybody knew there were birds in the stud horse. And all morning long, all the locals would come, jump in the blind, shoot their birds, and leave. That lasted for 3 days. And it was just magical to see the flooded timber and the birds in the timber. And, Spence, you mentioned Daniel. That's where Daniel shot his first birds.
That's cool.
So he kind of grew up in all this and had exposure to some of these wonderful experiences. Game and fish came in. Of course, as you know, Spence, the Sunken Lands was an outlaw's paradise.
For sure.
You know, my family's, my wife's.
Just to clarify for just a second.
Spence.
Yes, Spence. If anybody knows, it's Spence Halford.
Hold on. I'm not at all saying that I'm not an outlaw or haven't ever been an outlaw. But Mr. Thiel is not in a position to know whether I am or not. We don't
just
know each
know.
other that well.
You just heard.
Spence.
All I can tell you is I was still I actively hunted over there when I started at DU, and then it just changed. Game and Fish came in. They got rid of the permanent blinds, and it
Been
opened
tons
it up.
of ownership issues over there
Yes.
with what's the river channel and not the river channel. It's a gray area, is what you're referring to.
Yes, very
Tons
much
of
so.
gray area.
Yeah, but I'll say the hunting's gotten better. Hatchacoon's done a wonderful job of taking care of their property and enhancing their property. So Game and Fish has done a nice job in that part of the country.
Yeah. That's such a cool story. So your roots really are in development, fundraising
Yes.
development.
Yes.
And at the collegiate level. And that's, I guess, what your wife was doing at
No,
the
so
sorority level?
my wife's a pharmaceutical rep.
Okay.
But she was president of her sorority at LSU. She was doing an assignment in Indiana. We met, got married, moved south. I got I was very fortunate. If there was ever a time in my life that I needed a job, I got a job as head of development at Arkansas State University.
Oh, wow.
And the hunting culture, as you know, Spence, in Northeast Arkansas, it's all about duck hunting.
That's right.
And so, like everybody else up there, I was a member of the Rotary Club. All those guys in the Rotary Club,
That's right.
they all hunt.
That's right. Yeah.
And man, I couldn't have found a better place to get started. And became a member of the family camp and began to move and hunt other locations. And after 7 years at Arkansas State, I was the vice president for alumni development at University of Memphis. At President Lane Rollins' going away party, one of our wonderful, wonderful board members in Memphis is a gentleman by the name of Steve Reynolds, who was the president of Baptist. Steve was an ASU grad, and I had met Steve through ASU and of course duck hunting. At Lane's going away party, he said, "Hey Dan, there's a job open at Ducks Unlimited, and I want you to apply for it. I want you to look into it." I declined. I said, "Steve, I love what I do at the university. I believe in the mission of this university, and University of Memphis is a great institution.
It is.
And I was very proud of my position." And he said, "Dan, as a courtesy to me, will you at least call these people?" So I called. I actually caught the outgoing HR director on his last day in office, and he wasn't too excited. He was no more excited to talk to me than I was to talk to him. And he said, "Well, it doesn't sound like you're very interested in this. You're doing this as a courtesy to Mr. Reynolds." He said, "I'm going to put your name on a list, and they're going to hire a headhunter, and they're going to come down, and they'll talk to you if they're interested." 3 or 4 months go by, I get a phone call from a recruiter, and I wasn't interested, but I said, "You know what, I'll meet you at the World Club at the Memphis airport." And I met this very attractive young woman at the World Club, and I told her, "I'll give you 1 hour." I spent 5 hours. And here's the story that I'm about to tell you is as true today as it was 23 years ago. I was a DU member. I was active in DU in Jonesboro. I was a part of the local chapter. But in my world, Ducks Unlimited was a dinner once a year, and it was the DU magazine. I really had no idea what Ducks Unlimited did. What sold me on Ducks Unlimited was the recruiter. And the recruiter had done her homework. And she had maps, and she had books, and she had all this stuff that talked about the conservation I just told you about.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. And I felt like a fool because, man, I'd been a DU member for 7 or 8 years, and I had no idea what was going on behind the curtain at Ducks Unlimited. I remember going home and telling my wife, I said, "Hey, I think I'm going to go to work at Ducks Unlimited." And she said, "You are not." I said, "Oh, yes, I am." And I looking back, it's the greatest decision I've ever made. Wow. And because DU is such an incredible organization, I'll throw in a couple of quick statistics. So in the nonprofit world in the United States, there are 1.6 million 501c3 nonprofits. All universities, all churches, foundations, the Rotary Club, they're all 501c3s. Ducks Unlimited is a 501c3. Based on annual income, we're among the 250 largest in terms of income. So in the nonprofit world, we're a giant. And no, we're really a pretty well-kept secret in the Memphis area. People don't realize how big Ducks Unlimited is. The second statistic to share with this is we're an incredibly efficient organization, and it is by board mandate that 80% of every dollar raised go to conservation.
Wow.
And so we run this thing incredibly tight, incredibly efficient, and that's where the board comes in. And we have had great board members lead this organization. And to be a member of the board, number one, it's an honor, but it's also an incredible responsibility. The other thing I would want listeners to know, if you're on the DU board, you pay all of your own expenses to come to the meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, my office is going to send you a bill for every Diet Coke you drank and every dinner you enjoyed, because that's how you maintain that 80-20 program efficiency, and we're very proud of that. So
that's awesome.
That's how you get to be a great respected organization, is running it as you would run your family business.
That's right.
Yes, very much so.
That's really cool. Actually, I didn't realize that about DU on some of these things. Not to say that y'all were going out and doing these extravagant whatevers, but to have board members actually have to pay their own way to do something, and it's not just this great perk that they get to go to wherever the board meeting is. Like, that's interesting.
I'm pretty impressed with our board. Our board are very dedicated. They do this to serve. They could be on any other board that they want to. I will give a shout out. We have a Memphian for the first time ever as our president. Chuck Smith is a very successful businessman in Memphis. His company was National Guard product. Any of the metal that goes on a door is made by National Guard product. Chuck doubled and tripled the size of that business. He chooses to keep that business in Memphis because he believes in Memphis and he believes in products made in America, whereas a lot of his competition has gone overseas. Chuck is now chairman. He has sold the business to his two oldest sons, and it continues to thrive and be a very successful business. But what's neat about Ducks Unlimited, we now have a very, very successful business person serving as the national president of Ducks Unlimited. The other thing to share, one of the hallmarks of DU, it's a shared leadership. While we have a very strong chief executive officer, Adam Putnam, who Adam was the youngest member of Congress when he was elected many years ago in Florida, served 5 terms in Congress, was the elected secretary or commissioner of agriculture for the state of Florida. Adam has been an excellent chief executive officer, had only been here a few months when COVID hit. And not only did we survive COVID, we thrived during COVID. We went on lockdown, we laid employees off, but the majority of us worked every day. And then an incredible, this is, again, running DU as if you were going to run your own business. We're known for our event fundraising. Most every town in the United States has an annual Ducks Unlimited banquet. And, we created that banquet system. And it really is. I mean, if you read a lot of textbooks about fundraising, it gives credit to Ducks Unlimited in the mid-'60s coming up with the idea of the raffle, the auction, donated events. DU in '73 did the Gun of the Year program. The next year we did the Artist of the Year program. All have been incredibly innovative, and those dinners are the face of DU across the United States. When COVID hit, those dinners were shut down. And so within 12 days, our team of field fundraising leaders and our computer team created an online auction platform. And that online auction platform kept this organization alive. It kept the payroll happening. It kept money going into conservation. And, again, there could be a podcast on what did DU do during COVID. We actually had conservation staff guys living in campers because they couldn't get into a hotel and we had mission to deliver on the prairies. They stayed in remote camp locations just to get the job done.
That's so cool.
Because in a lot of parts of the country, the work we do on the landscape can only be done during certain months of the year.
That's right.
So you have to do it when you can. So we're very proud of where we've come through COVID.
Yeah, nonprofits and restaurants, I think, took the brunt of COVID.
They did.
I mean, and you don't hear a lot about nonprofits because there's not somebody crying
Right.
a song at the end of it, because a restaurant, there's an owner and there's a manager
Right.
and there's somebody who's so Jimbo Robinson is a good
Yes.
friend of ours.
Yep.
And we were in touch with him a lot during that time. We donated a few calls to the online auction, and I can echo what you just said about DU's resilience and flexibility to craft a strategy and to not just survive COVID, but to thrive, in COVID.
And so what's happened, across the United States, we have 92 or 94 Jimbo Robinsons, regional directors who work across the United States. Those guys do a tremendous job recruiting volunteers, engaging local communities, and doing these annual events. But what we learned through COVID is there will always be a market for online auctions. And so we have added a half a dozen or more new staff members in this last budget cycle just to see where this might go. Because there are some states, and it gets pretty complicated with state legislatures and gambling and raffles. And, there are X number of states that allow online raffles or raffle sales, done remotely. Wherever we can, we do it.
Yep.
And it's very successful.
Yeah.
And so we've learned through COVID how to grow this business.
Yeah,
And
that's so
it's
cool.
been successful.
That's so cool. And it's really, I think the most encouraging thing, two things you've said during our interview that to me are really encouraging. The first is just the emphasis on priority, listing what's most important, because it's, when you have access to a bunch of funding and a bunch of money out there, it'd be easy to just send it in a whole bunch of places without a hierarchy of importance, and a strategy and a goal. But then secondly, that kind of dovetails into the commitment and the concern for the longevity of the whole thing. Not just a great idea right now, or not just a big splash for next year, but to make sure that what you guys are doing is flexible and adaptive for the future, but so that it's around for another 100 years.
So we are very tightly guided by a strategic plan. And I've been a part of those plans for the last several years. We do one about every 5 years. We are also guided by an annual business plan. And whatever's in that plan, you will achieve that plan. We are a highly dedicated and driven group of people. You mentioned that your background was Deloitte. Mm-hmm. Bob Hester from Memphis was the senior advisory vice president who led the development of our strategic plan, which we are now implementing. And it's a very disciplined and very ambitious plan. And we need to be ambitious because the threats on the landscape in conservation
are equally as ambitious.
They are. And, there are so many issues that we face. California has these incredibly awful, draconian issues against firearms. And it makes our work in California all the more challenging. But we can't give up. We're going to work in California. We're going to find a way to have firearms as part of our event fundraising system. So while there are lots of challenges, there are also lots of opportunities.
Well, we are very grateful for your time and your dedication to the cause.
I feel like I learned a lot today.
Too. I don't know if you realize it. I think you realize what I'm about to say because you took a pretty lofty shot as you came in, but you're our first guest.
Oh, I didn't know that.
In the new
podcast studio. We've had several remote guests over the telephone, but we're 10 days from our quote unquote grand opening. Dan's response to that was, "The hell you are!" He said, "You got a lot of work to do." That's just the way we roll.
I couldn't find a place to park in the parking lot for all the construction guys working on your
That's
project.
right. You should have seen it 2 weeks ago, though. It's come a long way in 2 weeks.
I'll just tell you, this would be about like something we do at DU. That a small group of people with a vision and a passion can make this happen. So, and I know this. I know that you're doing some stuff at DU, and we value that partnership.
Oh, sure.
Because the hallmark of DU is all about the partnership.
Yep.
So
Yeah, well,
thank you for.
No problem. We're grateful for you guys and grateful for your time. And I said that about coming here because we really enjoy showing people our place, number one. But number two, it just makes for a better podcast
Right.
when we're all sitting here together versus over the telephone. And so it's a little thing, but we really appreciate you taking the
Making
time.
the trip.
Well worth the drive and to get through the speed traps of Somerville to get here.
That's right.
So, well, thank you.
Yes,
and, thank you for your support of Ducks Unlimited.
No problem. Thank you
Absolutely.
for your hard work, and we wish you many years of continued success at Ducks Unlimited.
Thank you.
And in all your other pursuits, your
Great.
family and hunting and all those things. So thanks again for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, man.
Appreciate it. Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Rolling Thunder Podcast.
Yep. We will catch you on the next one.
See you on the next one.